Hello, everybody. Today we will have kind of a wonderful talk. I'm very interesting that I was already waiting for it for a very long time, I might confess. Is opera as a safe and inclusive place, LGBTQ plus belonging, and the anthropology of opera. Today's speaker is Lia Lola Kotnik. Is a researcher in opera. She's a specialist in opera, which is really something very interesting and very unique. Media and communication, as well as an anthropologist, sociologist, philosopher, and professor of anthropology at the Department of Media Studies, Faculty of Humanities, University of Primorska, Capodistria, Slovenia. Her research and teaching focus on media and communication studies, manipulation studies, audience studies, opera studies, gender and transgender studies, fashion studies, the anthropology of spectacle, social and historical anthropology, and epistemology of the humanities and social sciences. Since 2003, she has co-authored and co-edited 19 books, 12 in Slovenian, 5 in English, 1 in French, and 1 bilingual in English and French, including Opera, Power and Ideology from 2010, Opera's Anthropology 2016, Small Places, Operatic Issues 2019, and Lying Beyond Sculptures 2025. Thank you very much for being with us. I think we will learn really a lot about this subject, which is very, very important.
Yeah, thank you for inviting me to speak in this Pride Month series dedicated to opera and queer, belonging within the Opera en Movimiento initiative organization. So I would like to begin with a very recent image. In May, I visited 3 opera houses in Vienna, Austria, Staatsoper, Volksoper, and Theater an der Wien. And this happened at the same time as the Eurovision Song Contest was taking place in the city. Vienna was full of music, glitter, and the vibrant festive atmosphere that the Eurovision Song Contest brings to its host city usually. What surprised me was the unexpected proximity between this mega event of popular culture and the city's opera houses, as if opera and Eurovision Song Contest had momentarily found themselves on the same public stage. However, what attracted my attention even more was something else. On all 3 opera houses, pride flags were displayed. The message was clear. Operatic Vienna recognizes and supports the LGBTQ plus community. Not long afterwards, in June, I saw the same kind of flag displayed on the facade in the Opera House in Graz, the second largest city of Austria, only about 65 kilometers from the Slovenian border and roughly 80 kilometers from Maribor, one of Slovenia's 2 opera cities. And then, inevitably, a question occurred to me. Why do pride flags not fly on the facades of the 2 Slovenian opera houses, in Ljubljana and Maribor? Of course, I have not made an official inquiry and therefore do not have an official answer, but the absence itself is telling. So, Slovenian opera institutions do not yet seem prepared, in one way or another, for such a visible act of institutional courage. It is one thing to say that everyone is welcome. It is another thing to make that welcome visible. A pride flag on an opera house is not merely a decorative gesture. It is not only a piece of fabric. It is a public statement. It says that the institution understands itself not only as a guardian of musical heritage, not only as a temple of high culture, but also as a public space in which diversity, equality, equity, and belonging matter. Diverse, but united in culture. Of course, a flag alone does not make any institution truly inclusive. A flag can be superficial, a flag can be opportunistic, a flag can hide contradictions, but the absence of a flag can also speak. So, silence too is a message. So the question I would like to ask today, tonight, this evening is, can opera be a safe and inclusive place? I believe it can. Historically, the opera house has not always been a safe or inclusive place in any straightforward social or institutional sense. Opera houses have often been hierarchical, elitistic, normatively gendered, class-coded, and culturally conservative. Yet, for many LGBTQ plus people, opera has long functioned as an imaginative, affective, symbolic, and sometimes almost secret place of recognition. Or, as musicologist Andrew Sutherland in his book Queer Opera argues, that for several centuries, opera houses have been safe havens for queer composers, librettists, performers, and designers, and yet it is only relatively recently that any serious attempt at queer representation in operatic works has begun to be realized. And here I would add, and for queer audience too, opera has been a place where many LGBTQ plus persons have recognized something before they were recognized by the world. That is why opera matters. Not only because of what happens on stage, but also because of what happens in the spectator, in the listener, in the body, in memory, in identification, in desire, and in the long history of passionate attachment to arts, beauties, voices, roles, gestures, disguises, and possible and impossible longings and imaginings. The relationship between opera and LGBT plus experience is, of course, not simple. It cannot be reduced to the claim that opera is naturally queer or that LGBTQ plus people have always been found opera houses safe. That would be historically false and politically naive. Opera houses have often been places of social exclusion. They have been connected to aristocratic prestige, bourgeois respectability, national culture, class distinction, and the disciplining of taste. They have often reproduced very conventional ideas of gender, marriage, family, and social order. And yet, paradoxically, opera as an art form has always exceeded normative order. This is one of opera's great contradictions. Institutionally, opera can be conservative. Aesthetically and affectively, it is often anything but. So opera is an art of excess, exuberance, expressivity. People do not speak, they sing. They do not merely suffer, they transform suffering into sound. They do not merely die, they die in arias, duets, ensembles, and orchestral apotheoses. Desire is rarely moderate, sexuality is rarely reasonable, gender is rarely simple. Bodies and voices do not always correspond in expected ways. Emotions are not hidden, they are intensified, stylized, amplified, and displayed. Long before opera houses used the language of diversity and inclusion, opera itself offered experiences of non-normativity. We can begin with the voice. Opera has never allowed the voice to remain merely natural. The operatic voice is trained, extended, stylized, disciplined, and yet strangely excessive. It comes from a body, but it seems to exceed that body. It is physical and metaphysical at the same time. It belongs to the singer, but it also becomes larger than the singer. For LGBTQ plus listeners, and especially for those who have experienced some form of distance between body, identity, social expectation, and desire, this can be deeply meaningful. In opera, the relationship between body and voice is never entirely stable. The history of opera gives us many examples. The castrato voice, historically central to Baroque opera, already complicates any simple alignment between sex, gender, body, role, and sound. Trouser roles, in which women sing male characters have long allowed opera to stage gender in ways that are far more fluid than ordinary social life would permit. Countertenors, mezzo-sopranos in male roles, sopranos as boys, men singing gods, women singing warriors. All these operatic conventions remind us that the stage has always been a place where gender is constructed, performed, displaced, and reimagined. Of course, we should not romanticize all of this. The history of castrati, for example, is also a history of violence inflicted on bodies. But from the point of view of reception and imagination, opera has repeatedly unsettled the idea that voice, body, gender, and identity must form a simple and stable unity. Then there is the diva or prima donna. The diva is not simply a famous female singer. She is a cultural figure, and as I argued in my scholarly paper, the idea of prima donna, a very special operatic institution. She condenses glamour, suffering, strength, fragility, discipline, sacrifice, public exposure, and emotional extremity. For many gay men, and more broadly for many queer spectators, the diva has been an object not only of admiration, but of identification. Why identification? Because the diva often appears as a figure who survives through performance. She is wounded and magnificent. She is excessive and controlled. She is exposed and powerful. She is adored and punished. She is both larger than life and terribly vulnerable. Her voice can become a refuge for those who have not yet found a voice of their own. This is one of the reasons why opera fandom, especially in the 20th century, became so closely associated with the figure of the so-called opera queen, the passionate gay male opera lover, often attached to particular singers, particular recordings, particular high notes or low notes, particular interpretations, and particular forms of ecstatic listening. Today, the term opera queen may sound dated, limited, even stereotypical, but it certainly does not represent the whole LGBTQ plus community. It is male-centered, of course, historically specific, and shaped by a particular culture of gay opera consumed by queer listeners. But it was inhabited by them. Opera became a place where desire, secrecy, longing, identification, glamour, pain, and coded recognition could circulate. Then there is camp. Opera and camp are not the same thing, but they have always had an affinity. Camp recognizes the seriousness of artifice. It understands exaggeration, stylization, theatricality, failure, glamour, and emotional excess. It knows that something can be artificial and deeply true at the same time. Opera is full of such truths. A woman sings for 10 minutes while dying of tuberculosis. A queen curses her daughter in coloratura. A betrayed lover takes 20 minutes to expire beautifully. Gods descend, statues speak, dead women return, and madness becomes music. From a strictly realistic point of view, this is absurd. From an operatic point of view, it is truth intensified. Queer spectators have often understood this very well, not because queer spectators are frivolous, but because queer lives have often required a sophisticated understanding of performance, disguise, codes, appearances, exaggeration, and survival. For people who have had to read social science carefully, perform normality, hide desire, invent style, or make identity legible under hostile conditions, opera's worlds of masks, voices, costumes, and excessive emotions may feel strangely familiar. In older operas, same-sex desire, gender ambiguity, and fluid gender casting were usually coded. displaced, demonized, made comic, or hidden in canonical subtext. One might think, for instance, of Oreste and Pylade in Gluck's Iphigenie on Tauride, Cherubino in Mozart's Le Nozze di Figaro, the composer in Strauss' Ariadne of Naxos, Octavian in the Rosenkavalier, and many others. These are not, of course, LGBTQ plus characters in the modern sense, but they show how opera has long provided material for queer readings of desire, gender, embodiment, and theatrical identity. But in the 20th and 21st centuries, we increasingly encounter operas that more directly address queer lives. We can think of several of Benjamin Britten's operas, which have often been read through the lens of coded homosexuality, outsiderhood, social exclusion, and forbidden or unacknowledgeable desire. We can think of Alban Berg's Lulu, with Countess Geschwitz, usually cited as the first overtly lesbian character in a major opera within the operatic canon. And we can think of contemporary works, such as Michael Tippett's The Knot Garden, often cited as one of the first major operas to feature an openly same-sex male couple on the operatic stage. Peter Eötvös' Angels in America, Theodore Morrison's Oscar, Charles Wuorinen's Brokeback Mountain, Gregory Spears' Fellow Travelers, or Laura Kaminsky as one which places a transgender protagonist in the center of an operatic narrative, and Jan Bell's Stonewall, described as the first opera to feature a transgender character written especially for transgender singer. This development matters. It means that LGBTQ plus people are no longer present only as listeners, fans, or coded figures. They increasingly appear as subjects of operatic representation, but representation is not the whole story. An opera house can stage an opera, a queer opera, and still not be an inclusive institution. It can present LGBTQ plus themes while remaining socially unwelcoming. It can program diversity without transforming the experience of belonging. This is why I want to insist that the question of the opera house as a safe and inclusive place is not only a question of repertoire. It is also a question of address. Who does the opera house speak to? Who does it imagine as its public? Who feels entitled to enter? Who is recognized not as a guest, not as an exception, not as a new audience to be developed, but as someone to whom opera already belongs? At this point, I would like to turn to a more personal register. For me, as a deeply passionate opera lover and a trans person, operatic experience and queer experience have never been completely separate. They have been rather deeply intertwined in the way I listened, in the way I identified, in the way I experienced voice, body, femininity, masculinity, glorification, marginalization, and transformation. In my life, opera and trans experience have been intimately connected. I sometimes wonder whether my passion for opera, which is my most healthy obsession, would have taken the same form had I not been a trans person. Opera offered me, long before I had a fully available language for myself, a world in which transformation was not an exception, a world in which voice could exceed the body, a world in which femininity could be vehemently stylized and overwhelmingly true, a world in which identity was performed but not therefore false. Opera taught me that artifice can be a path to truth. That may sound paradoxical, but opera is built on precisely this paradox. Nothing in opera is natural in the ordinary sense. The singing voice is cultivated, the gesture is stylized, the costume is designed, the death is composed, the emotion is shaped by music, and yet, when opera works, it can feel more truthful than ordinary speech. For someone whose life involves a complicated relationship with the expectations placed on nature, names, gender, voice, and appearance, this is not a marginal aesthetic pleasure. it is a form of recognition, it is existential. The fact that people on the operatic stage are so often trapped in roles assigned to them by family, society, law, religion, class, or power, and then sing beyond those roles, is one of the opera's most powerful emancipatory gestures. That singing beyond is deeply transformative. Opera, namely, repeatedly stages characters who are constrained by the world and yet exceeded through voice. Even when they die, they produce sound that cannot be contained by the social order that destroys them. This sense of transformation, to paraphrase the French sociologist Pierre Bourdieu, may be one of the reasons why opera has spoken so powerfully to many LGBTQ plus opera lovers. Opera gives this sense of transformation a stage. It gives pain a voice. It gives longing duration. It gives impossible desire music. And for those whose desires, identities, or bodies have been treated as excessive, shameful, illegible, or impossible, this can be profoundly moving and also deeply liberating. This is why I would not describe my attachment to opera only as passion, devotion, or even a healthy obsession. Opera was and is also for me a kind of life-invigorating lyrical therapy and autotherapy, not in a clinical sense, but as an aesthetic and existential practice that helped me endure, imagine, and become. A way of giving form to pain, rhythm to longing, voice to silence, and imaginative space to a self that everyday culture could not easily accommodate. I did not become an opera lover because opera was socially respectable. I became an opera lover because opera gave me access to forms of transformation that ordinary everyday culture, to paraphrase British scholar Raymond Williams, often tried to discipline. In that sense, opera was not simply an art form for me. It was a world, a parallel, affective, symbolic, and existential world in which I could imagine a more authentic selfhood in the possibility of transformation. In the 1990s, one book marked me deeply. Wayne Koestenbaum's The Queen's Throat, Opera, Homosexuality, and the Mystery of Desire. It gave me language to something I had experienced intensely and intimately. It articulated a queer sensibility in which the operatic voice became a site of identification, vulnerability, desire, and obsession. More specifically, it explored the relationship between homosexuality and opera, between gay men figured as opera queens and operatic divas, between closeted male listeners and female voices in full, open-throated public display, and more intimately still, between queer bodies and singing voices. It gave critical form to an attachment I had long felt but had not yet been able to think so clearly. With this ecstatic work, gays, lesbians, drag queens, opera queens, and other LGBTQ plus creatures and monsters finally received legitimate advocacy in the world of opera. Koestenbaum primarily focuses on the relationship between gay men and opera, approaching the topic from a personal perspective. The gay passion for opera is probably as old as opera itself. Nevertheless, very little was written about it for centuries. The presence of LGBTQ plus people in opera has long been taboo, even for researchers exploring the social reception of opera. Prior to this study, opera commentators, musicologists, music historians, and music scholars tended to neglect the topic, if not to regard it with outright hostility. Koestenbaum identifies a powerful affinity between the opera queen and the opera diva. The connection between the two figures is, of course, mediated by the voice. The screaming queen's throat and the singing diva's apparatus. In short, the voice as the center of the operatic experience is genderless. For singing divas, it allows them to become vicarious surrogates for closeted or restrained male listeners. For screaming queens, it allows them to publicly to free their restrained queer bodies from oppression. However, their social status in opera has historically not been nearly the same. While divas have predominantly been worshipped, opera queens have constantly been mocked and derided, as they still are today. No wonder that no one wants to admit to being an opera queen, even if one acts like one. The opera house is the only safe public place, the only obtainable paradise where the opera queen can escape homophobia and transphobia, at least for a moment, when he, she, or they give voice to it politically. For me, this book has never been, narrowly speaking, merely a homosexual operatic coming out, but also a kind of operatic autoethnography that implicitly speaks for transgender people in opera as well. Reading this book was liberating, but it also produced a certain discomfort. In Koestenbaum's description of the opera queen, I immediately recognized myself. At the same time, I felt uneasy about admitting this recognition aloud. For me, being an opera queen was evidently an operatic stigma, attached to something I had carefully concealed, or at least tried to make invisible. My own identity navigation between gay, third gender, and transgender positions. And yet, the opera queen in me did not want to remain hidden. She wanted to be embodied, voiced, vehement, imposing, grandiose, and spectacular, not as a stigma to be concealed, but as a visible, socially situated, and recognizable form of selfhood. The book also showed me that intimate opera fandom, eccentric diva worship, and excessive queer desire could be taught seriously. By refusing to separate passion from scholarship, it suggested that such passion might be a productive source of knowledge rather than an obstacle to it. In many academic contexts, love of opera is intellectually tolerated only if it is disciplined into proper academic expertise and canonical knowledge. Koestenbaum's book helped break that hierarchy for me. It suggested that a queer operatic sensibility is not something embarrassing or something to be hidden from serious opera scholarship, but may be the very condition of possibility for a different kind of opera scholarship. This is especially important in queer contexts. Queer knowledge has often emerged from forms of attachment that were not originally institutionally or authorized, from desire, from secrecy, from fandom, from nightlife, from camp, from style, from private archives, from gossip, from the body, from survival, from what respectable culture has so often dismissed as too different, too eccentric, too theatrical, too obsessive, too unserious, and of course too feminine, since so many forms of discrimination and exclusion are sustained by a deep misogyny. And opera paradoxically belongs not only to traditional, patriarchal, and established history, but also to the histories of queer attachment, marginalized desire, and alternative forms of belonging. Once I understood and accepted that my queer operatic passion could become a productive source of knowledge, it became difficult to remain only an opera lover. The opera lover had to become an opera scholar, or at least to find a scholarly language for her attachment. However, my initial academic engagement with opera soon encountered the limits of dominant academic discourses on opera, in which I found it difficult to recognize myself either as an opera lover or as an opera scholar. Academic discourses often domesticate what they study, which means that they can also make opera too fixed, too canonical, too glorified, or too mystified. They can transform operatic experience into a set of authorized objects like works, scores, librettos, composers, periods, styles, institutions. All of these are important, but they are not enough Opera is not only made of works, it is made of worlds. It is made of people who listen, remember, desire, classify, adore, reject, argue, collect, travel, compare, identify, suffer, and return. It is made of audiences, rituals, hierarchies, habits, gestures, foyers, programs, reviews, gossip, applause, silence, devotion, boredom, prestige, disappointment, and longing. This is where anthropology entered my operatic life. My own academic project in the anthropology of opera took shape between 2000 and 2004 as an examination of the challenges, contradictions, and problems of the opera sector in Slovenia, in an academic and cultural environment that was not particularly prepared for the idea that opera could be studied anthropologically. At the time, opera was usually treated either as musicological, historiographical, and theatrological repertoire, as music theater, as national culture, or as high art. These approaches were and remain important, but they did not fully answer the questions that interested me. I wanted to ask different questions. What is opera as an ideation, as an imagining, as a discourse, as a social practice, as a habitus? What kind of cultural world forms around it? Who has the authority to speak about opera? What kind of cultural, who is considered a legitimate opera knower? How do opera professionals and audiences behave, remember, classify, and attach themselves to opera? How is prestige produced? How is exclusion produced? So these questions led me toward what I later came to understand as an anthropology of opera. This was not simply a matter of adding context to musical works. It was not just saying, here is the score, and now let us add society around it. It was a more radical shift. It meant asking what opera becomes when it is approached as an ideational, discursive, and habitus-formed world. This shift, in my context, was a kind of heresy. That is why my current book manuscript is called Operatic Heresies. The manuscript returns to that earlier project and tells the story of a doctoral thesis project that tried to pioneer an anthropology of opera in Slovenia over 20 years ago, at a time when local academic and cultural circles were largely unprepared for such an approach. The heresy was not that I disliked opera, quite the opposite. The heresy was that I loved opera too seriously to leave it only to the authorized disciplines, approaches, and views. I wanted to think opera beyond the musicological, historiographical, and theatrological canon, beyond the official discourse of high culture and national cultural heritage, and beyond the assumption that legitimate knowledge about opera must always pass through established disciplinary protocols. Over the past 2 decades, I have been namely approached by a number of opera scholars, opera practitioners, and even opera lovers from abroad who discovered that I was engaged in anthropological research on opera in Slovenia and that I was developing a kind of anthropology of opera in this petite Central European country. So, and among their questions, one in particular stands out. What is the point of your anthropology of opera? Unfortunately, my immediate responses have often proved less than satisfactory. So I decided that this project perhaps deserves a more sustained, extensive, and analytically articulated answer to that line of questioning and inquiry. So, in reconsidering this past academic project from the beginning of my career, I became more aware that I cannot do it only as someone who studied or studies opera, but also as someone whose life was and is deeply shaped by opera. Opera gave me voices before I fully had one. It gave me forms of femininity, transformation, and truth before I could easily name my own. It gave me a world in which artifice was not the opposite of truth, and extravagance was not the opposite of seriousness. Later theory gave me a language for this attachment, and eventually anthropology gave me a method. And this brings me back to today's topic, the opera house as a safe and inclusive place. From an anthropological point of view, an opera house is never just a building. It is a symbolic space. It tells people who belongs and who does not. It teaches behavior. It distributes prestige. It organizes visibility. It produces insiders and outsiders. It defines legitimate taste. It makes some bodies feel at home and others feel that they are not merely being tolerated. This is why inclusion cannot be reduced to repertoire. Of course, repertoire matters. It matters whether opera houses stage works by LGBTQ plus composers, works with LGBTQ plus themes, works that represent queer and trans lives with dignity, complexity, and artistic seriousness. It matters whether singers, conductors, directors, dramaturgs, scholars, staff members, and audiences can live openly and safely. But inclusion is also ideational, discursive, spatial, symbolic, and affective. It concerns the foyer, the website, the program note, the public statement, the educational program, the choice of language, the behavior of staff, the visibility of welcome, and yes, sometimes the flag on the facade. The question is not only can LGBTQ people attend the opera? Of course they can. The deeper question is are they imagined as part of the opera house's public? Are, are their histories acknowledged? Are their attachments understood as legitimate? Are there ways of listening, identifying, remembering, and loving opera recognized as part of opera culture? The connection between opera and LGBTQ plus people is not a recent invention of diversity policy. It did not begin with institutional inclusion programs. It is older and more intimate and more deeply rooted in the history of watching and listening. Queer people did not arrive at the opera house yesterday asking to be included. Many were already there, in the gallery, in the stalls, in the recordings, in the archives, in the fan cultures, in the devotion to divas, in the coded readings, in the whispered identifications, in the passionate memories, in the bodies that heard themselves differently through opera. In that sense, the pride flag on Opera House does not introduce something foreign into opera. It recognizes something that has long been there. A pride flag on an opera house cannot solve all the problems LGBTQ plus people face in their everyday lives, but it does not make one thing visible. It does make one thing visible. It says that LGBTQ plus people are part of the imagined community of the opera house. If I paraphrase British scholar Benedict Anderson. In other words, it can make those problems a little less invisible, a little less isolating, and perhaps a little more bearable by saying, we see you, for us you exist. That is why symbols matter. They are not merely abstract ideas, they are forms of embodied knowledge, or to paraphrase Michel Foucault, ways in which recognition and belonging are inscribed in bodies, spaces, and social practices. So, can the opera house be a safe and inclusive place? My answer is yet. Yes, but not automatically. It becomes inclusive when it recognizes that opera is not only heritage but also belonging. It becomes inclusive when it understands that LGBTQ plus people are not external to opera culture, but part of its history. It becomes inclusive when it makes welcome visible. It becomes inclusive when it has the courage to say publicly and without ambiguity, this place is also yours. This place is also your temple. This place is also your home. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Very, very interesting. I have some, well, not questions, maybe ideas. Uh, I really like when you were talking about the division between one, the dimension about the diva and how people they were following. And
Yeah.
it came really to my mind, for example, 19th century, which is a period that I work a lot, and how eventually the diva was a very an ideal of in many ways, not just what was really on the stage with the famous sopranos, let's say
Mm-hmm.
Pasta, and so on. But
Mm-hmm.
also with the fact that the sopranos and female singers at the opera were some of those jobs where women were able to sign their own contracts. While in other,
Mm-hmm.
yeah, in other activities, in the regular life, whatever other type of jobs that they will do, women were not allowed to. Their male
Exactly.
figures were kind of possessing any rights
Mm-hmm.
of all
Mm-hmm.
these things. So at the end, it was a situation out of the ordinary, and the opera in that case turned to be precisely an ideal or a perspective ideal of what they would be. So I think it was really extrapolated from the audience to see, okay, this situation about the diva is the power that we could get, or ideally we
Mm-hmm.
want to. So I think that was a very nice thing, really.
Yeah, because it has always a contradictory position in the opera system, in the opera. She was worshipped, but she was also controlled, vulnerable, disciplined, because the opera system was patriarchal, was centric, and so in this, yeah, and but it diva can give a voice to a marginal community as well.
Indeed. You know,
Yeah,
that's a very good thing. And the
yeah.
other thing that I was kind of
That's
considering,
why
tell me.
that's why I say we need divas. We need opera prima donnas.
Indeed.
And sometimes I joke, maybe sometimes they are the only reason why one performance or a production is worth to visit. If other things are not good, if the production is not well, if the costumes are not well, but if it is a prima donna excellent, it can save the performance.
Yes, it put like a stamp or a guarantee stamp. Uh,
Yeah,
you need to watch it and you will enjoy it complete,
yeah,
or reformed could be.
yeah,
So
yeah,
something like that. And it's a system that prevails since, I don't know, since times of
yeah.
Venetian opera, where we can find some of the early divas, for example, that
Mm,
they are creating. Other point that was very good that I really like is at the end the voices, the tesituras. Because
yeah,
one thing is at the end in terms of the opera, playing with the voices and how each voice can be whatever. Sometimes the soprano can be female, sometimes the soprano can be male.
yeah.
So sometimes the baritones or bass, for example, can be kind of these huge masculine figures, or they can be all these female males that we can find, for example, and so
Hmm.
on. So it's always this idea of
Yeah.
playing with the voice that can be so flexible.
Absolutely, absolutely. This is the voice is the most intimate and crafted, and at the same time the most excessively public element in opera, actually. And at the same time, if you ask singers, they will all say that they feel they are singing very intimately. That this is a very intimate act of doing when they sing publicly. Yeah. Even though voice then becomes public, becomes um, our property in a way. We take this voice for us. But yeah, many singers they describe this when they are on stage and they sing that they feel that this is very intimate act actually.
Yes, and also I remember, I think it was Adorno who was precisely portraying the audiences, the operatic audiences, some that they cannot and they shouldn't sing, or somebody was putting some restrictions to the audience because they need to
In
be
his sociology
spoken
of opera
via the
music.
singers, via really the performers are those who are going to speak from them or something like that. In that
Mm,
situation, which I find kind of like very appealing, precisely
mhm.
returning with the idea, okay, with the diva or any type of singer, okay, I have some feelings that I want to share, I want some ideas that I want, some concerns that I would like to scream to yell, really, but I
Yeah.
cannot for many reasons. The society, but the stage can do it.
Hmm.
No, that's very interesting. Really, very, very, very good talk. I really appreciate it. It was very, very
Yeah,
interesting.
thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you. It was my great pleasure to participate in this your series. And also other talks were very interesting because they were all very diverse, very different.
Yes,
They actually covered very different aspects of this world, of this or this connection between performing arts and queer culture or LGBTQ plus culture community. So they covered different aspects.
yes. I wanted to create kind of a very diverse event within
Yeah,
all this
yeah,
spectrum. But say, like, okay,
yeah,
from different parts, from very straight academic, let's go to other
exactly.
perspectives, some kind of like historical ways, and so like, to make precisely. Because it's
Yeah.
a so complex subject, I was like, okay, let's try to spread
Mm-hmm.
it.
Yeah.
Thank you very
So,
much.
yeah.
When the video will be ready between today and tomorrow, I will upload it to our YouTube
Okay.
channel.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you very much. And wishing you all the best. And we stay in touch.
Thank you. Bye bye.
Okay.